Yeah, as Grace mentioned, join in with menti.com. It helps us to create a very interactive discussion. My suggestion is, since we are really with a small group, just pop up questions, open your mic and pop up questions if you have some. Yeah, it won't disturb me, and I think it will only make the webinar richer. Now, let me give a short introduction about myself. You can scan my QR code to see my full LinkedIn profile. I started in service management in the beginning of the 90s in a telco in the Netherlands. And basically, I've followed everything that happened in IT service management. The last 10 years, we are very active as lean and agile and digital transformation coaches in the industry here. And one thing we really figured out in this world is that there is a big conflict between the agile execution of IT services versus the traditional IT service management approaches. And I hope that with this webinar, I can shed some light on where to pay attention to and how to approach an effective integration between an agile way of working versus the controls we want to have in traditional IT change management. Yeah. Now, let's start with this one to see who is in our audience. If you can type in your name, yeah, then we can see how many of you are joining us interactively. Okay, 6 of you are joining us interactively. I use this slide as a teaser to see how this works, and for you to get a little bit acquainted with the app. We go to more scenarios here. Yeah, let's start with the next one. Your focus area, is that more in IT service management environment, or is that really in change management? Or are you more from the software or agile development areas, or from the business pillar? And you can select your answer, and we get a bit of a view of where you are. That is really interesting to see. 5 people from the business area, nothing from IT service management, change management, or development. I think that makes it an interesting discussion, because in my experience from a business approach, what we want is to have effective services. And if you make use of digitization, you definitely want to make sure that the IT services are flexible, dynamic, and responding swiftly to business changes. If you have the feeling that there is a conflict within the IT organization between development and IT, that only limits business results and business improvements. So I will focus a little bit on that direction in this webinar. Yeah. If we try to understand what is really happening in Agile, and I can recall that even before Agile, when I was managing traditional software projects. In software management, we want to have software available, but in a project, changes will always come in. Yeah, my experience is this: I scope a project, I get a list of requirements, and halfway during the project, the business already comes in, but I also want to include this and that in the project. And that really requires an adaptive approach. And I think the first elements we started to work with was really the environment in extreme programming and dynamic system management to adopt our projects to software development. Later in 2001, Agile came around the corner, which was invented on a hill. Or actually, the Agile principles were designed on a hill on how Agile should be approached, or how software development should be approached in an Agile way. And basically, what we want with Agile is to take small but frequent steps so that we continuously learn from each step and and decide what we're going to do with the next step. Yeah, if we look at a traditional approach of IT service management, specifically to change management, um, we really focus on risk control. We want to make sure that whatever is being implemented is implemented carefully with a proper risk assessment, and try to ensure as much as possible that every implementation, every release is done in a safe way without causing disruptions afterwards. Now, that by itself is a conflict. Yeah, because if you are being made responsible according to the change management principle to do risk control and to assure stability and safety of services, the one thing you don't want is dynamics. You want to have stability. You want to rigidly control that stability. Whereas in Agile, we want to do more and more releases. We focus much more on the velocity of software development. Yeah, and today Agile is not limited to software development anymore. We help organizations in sales, marketing, in business environments with Agile. But frequently, if we talk about digital transformation, it does lead to frequent changes. And yeah, with the traditional approach of infrastructure management as described in FITSM, USM, ITIL, and so on, the focus is really on rigidly controlling changes. No, we need to find a solution for that. Yeah. Starting with the background on IT change management, there is a proper process for that. Yeah, and it should start with creating a request for change. We record it, we review it, we assess it, prioritize it, and after that we authorize the building and the testing. Through that cycle in change management, we coordinate the change, and when the building and testing is completed, change management is responsible for approving the deployment or the release. We coordinate the release, and we review at the end, after the release, what the effects of the change are. Now, my experience is that where we all know that we should start at the beginning of the process, frequently only when a project is at the end stage, when everything already has been built, sometimes when testing already has been done, that is when a change is being registered. This means that from an IT change management, there is very little of added value we can give to a change. Yeah, and the right mindset in IT change management should be that we want to make every change successful. But if a change comes in at the end of the life cycle, there is very little added value you can give to that. The only thing you can do is rigidly control whatever comes in. Yeah, and that already gives one limitation. Yeah, if we look at the agile approach, and I have depicted Scrum here, not because I consider Scrum truly agile, but it is the most adopted way of organizations that start with agile. If you guys are familiar with the Agile Manifesto, there are 12 principles jotted down in the Agile Manifesto. However, everybody understands those principles. Nobody understands how to actually use them in an effective way. And Scrum was actually a mechanism that transformed these agile principles into a process And most organizations, if they want to use a new way of working, they like to see a process, they like to see roles and responsibilities. And this is one of the reasons why Scrum became extremely popular. But you have to realize that Scrum is still agile in a process way. It is not truly agile. Yeah. Now, if we compare where we start with where most organizations start, that when a change is ready, so when a release is ready, that is where the request for change is being forwarded to the IT change management forum. Yeah, and also in proper agile execution, the moment we created sprint planning, that is where we already should align with change management. And frequently this does not happen. Yeah, the whole objective, if imagine being an agile team that creates releases every 2 weeks, and I have to wait a week for the change management to approve, that leads to a lot of frustration. Yeah, and I could have avoided that by just starting as early as possible in the life cycle with an agile team when we know what we're going to do, and that is the sprint planning, basically. Yeah, once the sprint planning has been reviewed, when we have refined the sprint planning and acknowledged it, that is the moment where we should align with IT change management. Now, one limitation in that discussion is tooling. Yeah, for a lot of agile teams, Jira is a very popular tool. However, Jira frequently is not integrated with the IT change management tool. Yeah, and that already leads to miscommunication or lacking in communication in general. Yeah, so if we want to make sure that different approaches in an organization works in an integrated way, we also have to make sure that tools are being integrated. Yeah, and if you make use of modern tools, this integration is not a big issue. But if you use legacy tools, frequently those interfaces cannot be established. Yeah, and I think that is a good thing to realize as well. Yeah. Now, if you depict this, if you depict what is going on in IT change management, and if you depict what is going on in the agile teams, yeah, in your view, um, where do you see the most of the conflicts and the frustrations in your organization? Yeah, don't forget to scroll down and click on submit. You can use the slider to move it more to strongly agree or strongly disagree. One response is in, two responses are in. Okay, we see a little bit deviation now. Yeah, and for what I see right now, honestly, I'm not really surprised. Yeah, communication, especially in an organization that is very silo based. So I have my development teams, I have my IT infrastructure team, and they are really different teams. In a silo-based organization, what happens with teams is that we fairly quickly put a wall around our team. We try to do everything within our team that is according our responsibilities. But communication to other teams is significantly reduced. We focus on our own garden and we don't care about other teams, their garden. You know. That has a negative effect on collaboration. Yeah, now what I already mentioned, misaligned releases and sprints, we tend to only integrate the different teams and the different processes at the end of a life cycle. And we really should start earlier in the life cycle to make sure that we properly can align. Yeah, and the conflicting objectives, that I think that's a straightforward point. Um, in Agile, I want to do as many releases as possible where in IT change management, I want to have as little releases as possible. And most organizations are being measured that way. Yeah, the IT infrastructure teams are measured by stability, so they don't want to have changes. Yeah, their targets are written down in the service level agreement, and they need to achieve their SLA targets. Yeah, where the SLA targets for the development teams is frequently based on velocity, how many releases or how much code can you produce in a certain time span, and that by itself is already an conflicting scenario. Yeah. Now, one of the things we do talk about a lot in organizations is to see how we can align the objectives with the different teams. Ideally, create a shared objective between both teams rather than a conflicting objectives. Yeah, and you will see that if you look at DevOps, this is basically the founding principles of DevOps. Yeah, make a shared objective between the development and the IT service management team or the IT infrastructure team to make sure that we all work along the same goal and the same vision rather than having conflicting objectives. This is easier said than done, however. Yeah, and in the rest of this discussion, in the rest of this webinar, I try to give a bit of a light on how you can create a smoother alignment between the development environment as well as the change management environment. Yeah. So when we first look at the concepts of the different worlds, in IT change management, we really focused on structured, mature processes. Yeah, and when we talk about a structured, mature process, we talk about predictability. Yeah, and that is already an conflict with the agile approach, because we in agile Scrum we actually collaboration over processes is one of the principles. Yeah, so in agile we talk a little bit more about empirical process control. It is heavily based on autonomy, self-organization. Yeah, and so the team should decide what is the most effective way to set up a process and to run a process. Yeah, where in IT change management, we really focus on structured processes over multiple teams. Yeah, and that is also the basis where IT change management or IT service management comes from. Yeah, if I look at its origin, which was the late 80s, yeah, we already identified that if we want to make sure that the different teams, because back then everybody was in a silo organization. Yeah, if we want to make sure that the different teams work in a similar way, or ideally in the same way, we have to make sure that a process goes over multiple teams and every team has to follow that standardized process, and that creates predictability. And in an agile world, that is not the most ideal way of working, because structured processes do only work if you have strong governance in place in an organization. Yeah, and the whole idea of governance is that you get compliance, where in an agile environment we're not looking so much for compliance, we much more look for engagement. Yeah, and that already makes a major difference in culture between the two worlds. Yeah. In the traditional IT service management approach, we focus a lot on stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement, relationship management. And whenever a new change comes in, we really want to make sure that all the required stakeholders are informed or involved in the decision making, to make sure to understand all the risk aspects from the different stakeholders before we approve a change. Yeah, where in an agile environment, it is more about collaboration and co-creation, to make sure that we get the maximum value out of a change. Yeah, and that mindset already is totally different. As I said, I think the first approach we need to take in IT change management is focused on making every change successful rather than trying to control every change. And I know that this is a difficult step to make in a lot of organizations. especially when your organization is heavily regulated. Look at the financial services industry or the healthcare industry, oil and gas industry. Those are very heavily regulated environments. And frequently you will see that in change management, we copy that regulation mentality and focus heavily on the governance aspects, the policies, to make sure that everybody complies. Yeah, so compliance at this point for those organizations is more important than value. Yeah, and exactly what I was just saying, and what I'm trying to emphasize on. I think the first step we need to do is, I'm not saying compliance is not important, but every change should have value. If a change doesn't have value, we should not do a change. Why would you introduce risk if it doesn't create value? Yeah, so the best approach of change management is trying to make every change successful and maximize the value in the change. That means that the agile teams and the IT change management teams really need to focus on co-creation and collaboration rather than rigid control. Yeah. Now, proper communication is really important, making sure that all stakeholders are effectively informed about the change, what the effects of the change are. Yeah, and yeah, what you will see, and this is really still a strong metric for most traditional IT organizations. 80% of the incidents we have are due to changes, and that is an extremely scary number. Yeah, and that, in my opinion, that doesn't really give the right view, um, because what we should measure as well is the value each change brings. Yeah, but the 80% of changes, so 80% of incidents are caused by changes, is a well-known metric in most organizations. You will see that if an organization moves a little bit to CI/CD, making use of the DevOps principles, that statistic significantly improves. But for most organizations in a traditional change environment, we actually see that how well we try to control the risks and how rigid we try to manage the process, 80% is a really bad number still. Yeah. So one thing that we really want to focus on in an agile approach is prioritize on value. Yeah. So what works in both scenarios is, for example, the Moscow prioritization. Yeah, Moscow stands for must have, should have, could have, won't have. That is more an criticality prioritization. When we go to a value-based prioritization, we talk more about shorted weighted job first, which means if I have two initiatives, one initiative takes 6 months, the other initiative takes 1 month, but they represent the same value, I prioritize the 1 month above the 6 months, of course, because that means if I do that initiative earlier, I get the returns from that initiative that can be used as an investment for other initiative. Yeah, and that is the whole concept behind iterative development. If we do agile in an appropriate way, you will see that an agile project starts funding itself due to iterative releases, short releases, short development cycles, frequent releases, and each release represents a small amount of value that actually compounds on each other. And you will see that basically agile projects, yeah, agile development projects, it can start funding itself during the project itself. And this is one of the reasons why we sense that the agile way of working is a major financial risk control for most organizations. Now, if we look at those challenges, what I just displayed between the IT environment versus the IT change environment versus the agile environment, um, what kind of challenges do you see in your organization? And feel free to jot down everything that comes to your mind. As you saw in the previous one, your responses are confidential. Your name will not appear to those responses. For the response with project team members, will you be able to specify that a little bit more? Do you mean um, different objectives between the different team members, or project team members that don't understand what we try to achieve? Yeah, frequent updates on requirements during the development phase. That is a very common one. Adaptability and change. That is something we try to solve with an agile approach. Uh, Change requests during an ongoing sprint. I will focus on that a little bit later. That is a very interesting one. Changes that require security approval. Yep, a very common one, and very a compliance-based discussion as well. Vague requirements. That is an interesting one. Let me focus a little bit on the change request during an ongoing sprint. Um, I've seen this frequently in when helping organizations to adopt an agile way of working. Yeah. The challenge is that an organization considers agile as an do it quick and dirty approach. I actually have been in organizations where they thought agile means that we don't have to do planning, everything can be done immediately. That is not agile. That is chaos, and agile is not the same as chaos. I hope you understand that discussion. In agile, we still plan. However, our planning horizon is, for example, 2 weeks, not 2 months. The moment we agree with the product owner on a sprint plan, that sprint plan per definition is fixed. So what we do for the next 2 weeks is a fixed discussion. Um, I know that the business tries to poke into the sprint plan and add on new things to the sprint plan. That is something, and you require a strong product owner for that discussion, but that is something that should be avoided. There are always exceptions, but the only exception is business continuity. Yeah, so if the business really is in a critical scenario, I think that is the only acceptable scenario that you change a sprint plan. In all the other scenarios, any change request that comes in during a sprint probably will be prioritized in the next sprint, but not in this sprint. And that is something you have to start working with really strictly. Because if you don't work that way, basically you set up an agile team to fail, and that is not what we want. Yeah, so even so for an agile team, though velocity is an important one, what is more important than velocity is quality. Everything we deliver should be according to the acceptance criteria we set in a definition of done, for example. Yeah, and if we don't have that discussion appropriately, then an agile team, the only thing an agile team does is racing, yeah, full throttled racing, and that does not lead to very effective releases. And there is a huge risk of developing technical debt fairly quickly. Yeah, and so that is something we definitely want to avoid there. Security approval. So the whole idea of having effective agile teams is that an agile team is not a team of developers only. It should be a multidisciplinary team. That means in an agile team, security specialists should be involved, either full time or as a subject matter expert, so that in the sprint, security is fully aligned with the user stories, and how those user stories are being given shape in a solution, in code, when we talk about software development. Yeah, and how that relates to risk in security. Oh, no, my excuses. Yeah. So it is um, the same scenario as you see right now, as we discuss between IT change management and an agile approach, will happen between security and an agile approach if security follows a similar approval cycle as an IT change management cycle. So in the rest of this discussion, try to look at security and security approvals in the same way as we discuss IT change management. Now, the last one, I find that vague requirements. Um, uh, my assumption right now is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my assumption right now is that the way you have adopted Agile is still in an infant stage, and the clients, the users, the customers do not really know how to create proper user stories. Yeah. What we see in that scenario frequently is that user stories are so high level that we have a bit of understanding what you want, but we have no clue what you really want to achieve with that user story. Yeah, and here is where as an agile coach in your organization, you really should help coach the users how to create proper user stories. Yeah, and there is a massive difference between a requirement and a user story, and this is really the basics of an agile approach. What we try to achieve in organizations is to help people understand that a requirement basically is a to-do list. Yeah, a user story is value driven. Yeah, so a requirement basically tells you what you need to do, where a user story tells a scenario what a user wants to do and what value they want to see out of that action. Yeah, so and that is the first thing that needs to change. It is impossible to create a definition of done if you have user stories that are way too high level. Yeah? Try to mature in setting up user stories. Yeah, and you can still call them requirements if that is the term that is used in your organization. It's just terminology, but and it is impossible to work in an agile way if the organization still comes with traditional requirements. Yeah, there is no agile approach in that. It is not value driven. All right, thanks for your response, guys. Let's move to the next one. Now, the first step we normally work with in integrating an agile team with a change management team is to set a few touch points. Yeah, and the first touch point is basically when we create a definition of done as an end of a sprint planning, that is already our change assessment. Yeah, and this is information that should be shared between both the change management team and the agile team. A good definition of done describes what needs to be created in a sprint and what the acceptance criteria or the quality criteria are for the results of that sprint. Yeah, and that already gives a good idea about what we're going to do. Yeah, so and what I mentioned with the previous slide, also with the assess step, do involve security here. Yeah, so if you do not have a security specialist in your sprint team or in your agile team, this is the moment where you want to invite a subject matter expert from security to already understand the potential security risk at an assessment point. Yeah, and the moment you do a refinement, this is where, as a security subject matter expert or a security specialist, you already can highlight certain risk. And here is where you create security awareness. Yeah, and the better you're capable of highlighting security risk at or during the refinement stage, the better the sprint team is able to avoid those security risks. Yeah, so involve in the assessment of the sprint planning at the end of the sprint planning the change management team and the security team. Yeah. From the flow itself during the sprint, um, try to create feedback loops. Basically, keep each other informed. Yeah. So, and in a sprint, this is a lot easier to do. This can be done by the agile coach or the scrum master. Yeah, to explain a little bit about progress, to explain a little bit about the challenges you face during a sprint. Yeah, you will always have some challenges in a sprint, and the more transparent you communicate that, yeah, the easier it is to mitigate that. Yeah, and then make sure that both security and change management are involved in during the approval stage, and that is not an handover scenario. Yeah, so I hope that you understand what I'm trying to say here. When we do the review, make sure that change management and security management are involved in that review, and that you don't do just a review in your agile team and then throw it over the wall to the change management or the security team. That causes a lot of waste, yeah, and creates a lot of yeah, what we call a reduction in flow of what we actually try to achieve and improve with an agile way of working. Yeah. Now, let's talk about a few strategies we want to go through. Yeah, so when we really look at an organization based on agile thinking versus service management thinking, yeah, and so this comes a little bit towards the mindset and the culture behind it. Change management is really a ticket system. Yeah. So we focus a lot on process controls, policies, and audits to assure compliance and risk management. As I said, this is normally the change management focus. This is how most organizations are being educated in managing changes. Yeah. In an agile way, change management is so the change management at code. I wanted to say, yeah, but it is integrated in the pipeline, in the CI/CD pipeline. Yeah, so it partly is about automation. It partly is about making sure that we understand what the change is about and understand the risk it can create. But in a good agile way, the changes we do are really small. They are not big changes that require a big assessment. So from in an agile approach, we really should adopt to small frequent changes. Yeah, and this includes that small frequent changes also comes with small risks. And when I say risk, both from a change management as well as from a security perspective. Yeah. So if you look where you are in your organization, and you can use the indicator on your screen to point that more to the left or to the right. If you would rate your organization, where are you currently? More towards system management think, service management thinking, or agile thinking? Yeah, you can just slide the pin. Don't forget to click on submit. All right. Yeah, so it all right. So I see more the agile thinking in place, but I also see that some organizations have a real challenge being very traditional in service management thinking. This can be due to regulations, yeah, and compliance requirements. Um, However, a regulation or requirement, compliance requirement never tells us how to do things. They just want to know how we control things. Yeah, and if we can make a CI/CD pipeline that is fully in control with automated audit trails. Yeah. All right. Enough said. Yeah. The scope. that is really a challenge. Yeah. In traditional service management thinking, once the scope is set, then it is fixed. Yeah, and that is really. I remember my first software projects, and I was educated in PMP, and that means my KPIs as a project manager, you have to deliver a project within time, within budget, within scope. And I already learned fairly quickly that if you want to really control your project, you make sure that the set of requirements at the beginning of the project are signed off, and from that moment, that list of requirements goes into the freezer, and nobody is allowed to change for that, because I know that if in the midst of my project, my customer comes with a change request for the project, um, I need to re-evaluate my project plan. I need to re-evaluate the engineers I have in my project. I need to re-evaluate and rewrite the business case and come with a new approval for an addition to the business case that will be sent to management team. The management team will send it to the senior management team, and suddenly we are 2 months later before we have an approval, and that creates a massive disruption in my project. Yeah, so in the traditional world, this is a major issue. We want to make sure that um, the scope and the requirements are fixed at start. And but if you have a project of 6 months, things will change. Yeah, and this is the beauty within an agile way. We have micro projects of, for example, 2 weeks. Yeah, and that definitely helps with the urgency of requirements, because if the business now comes in with a new requirement, it can be done in 2 weeks. Yeah, we can reprioritize it and put it on the top of our list of urgent user stories at the beginning for the next sprint. Yeah, so the agile way of thinking is embrace change. Yeah. Um, Here is again a really important role for the product owner to make sure that before a new sprint starts, the product backlog is properly reprioritized. The product owner really has to manage the dynamics in the product backlog, and have a good case scenario for the next sprint. Yeah, and then when we discuss the sprint goal before we start making the sprint plan, um, the product owner should clearly explain what that at that moment most urgent business priorities are, that should be acknowledged. And as an agile team, you make sure that you create a proper sprint goal, and that the important elements of the urgent elements of the business are included in that, and all related elements that support the sprint goal are the other user stories in which I fill my sprint planning. So by default, an agile kind of planning is a dynamic planning. However, yeah, and I mentioned that it doesn't mean that you can break into a sprint and add requirements. This is something you only should allow if there is a business urgency, yeah, a business calamity or a contingency for normal requirements that just comes in and are urgent. It still can be planned, but it will be planned in the next sprint, and we don't break open an existing sprint. And if you have that really frequently, um, one thing that you might want to think of is your sprint frequency, yeah, and your sprint duration. So I've worked with an organization where they had sprints of 4 weeks, and frequently they were poked by the business to add things to the sprint plan in the midst of a sprint. Yeah, and if that is incidental, you can manage it. I didn't say with that you should allow it, but you can manage it. If it happens frequently, you might want to consider to move to a 2 week sprint in order to address the business dynamics in a better way. But once you have a sprint plan, that sprint plan basically is fixed as well. Now, in your scenario, your organization, where would you assess at what area you are? Is that more towards service management thinking or more towards agile thinking? And this is interesting, guys, because I was assuming that I would see a similar deviation as with the previous question. Um, but I see that the scope is still quite rigidly controlled in your scenario. Yeah. And maybe this is due to the fact how IT change management is controlling a change calendar. It could be, yeah. And when I see this deviation, what I frequently see in organizations is that there is a legacy IT environment. Um, think, for example, an SAP environment where we only have quarterly releases, and those releases are really tightly controlled. Yeah, and um, is that a proper environment to be agile? It can help, but you need to realize that the basic principle of an agile way of working doesn't deliver the same value in this scenario. Yeah, so if you really have release planning and release windows, it normally means that you stack up your the output of your releases to a release plan, and maybe once a month or once a quarter you do those releases. Do one thing that I would really advise in such a scenario, both for the agile teams as well as the change management team, is that you keep in mind what the consequences are for such an approach towards technical debt. Yeah, if I'm an agile team and I create a result in one sprint, but only 3 months later it is released, and I have a few incidents out of that release, I really need to think back what I did 3 months ago in that sprint in order to relate back how to solve that, and how that might have effects on subsequent sprints. Yeah, and if you're not careful, that has a whole cascading effect to all the subsequent sprints, and that causes a lot of additional work. And this is a perfect opportunity to dive into technical depth. Yeah, and it's something you really want to avoid as much as you can. My suggestion normally is that, well, if this is the IT environment you have, you can't just throw away your legacy. Yeah, try to focus, and it is one of the slides we come to later, but in testing, try to include your testing as early as possible and as realistic as possible towards a production environment. And I know that frequently here is where the challenge is. Yeah, and I know a lot of organizations where their test environment is not identical to their production environment, and that means that the testing quality comes with limitations. All right, governance. Yeah, and what we frequently see with governance, especially in heavily regulated organizations, is that really causes a junk amount of policies. Yeah, and what we want with policies is that people that to follow those policies in order to reduce uncompliant behavior. Yeah, and we basically call that reduce variance. Whereas in an agile environment, especially if we have an automated agile environment, policies are basically built into the code. Yeah, and so as an agile team, I just make sure that I work on the user stories to maximize the value we create. And it goes to a whole CI/CD environment where this is automatically structured and aligned with the policies. Yeah, now, same discussion here. If you look at your organization, would you go more towards reduce variance or policy as a code? Yeah, and that doesn't really surprise me compared to the previous question. Yeah, if you're heavily regulated, an organization tends to go to a governance approach that is based on reducing variance rather than and understand the risk you have and try to build that in control in terms as code. All right, next one. The processes. Yeah. In service management thinking, especially when we talk about the well, both the security as well as the change approach, yeah, it's a cascading approval cycle. And I know organizations that approve changes through multiple meetings, not just one meeting. Yeah, and those meetings are sequential. Yeah, and first at the basic level, then and at managers level, and then at a senior management level, based on the change impact. Yeah, and frequently you will see in that scenario that every change has to go through the change advisory board, and that of course creates a lot of additional work. There's a lot of waste in that discussion. Yeah, and at the same time, beside waste, it creates a lot of delay in executing smaller changes. Yeah, in an agile approach, yeah, we have a different look at how changes are being controlled. Yeah, one thing we work with many organizations is to reconsider the use of standard changes. Yeah, so changes that have a minimal amount of risk, a minimal amount of resource usage for implementation. Uh, those changes can be basically pre-structured. Think in terms of policy as a code in that discussion. Yeah, and those changes can be fully in control by the agile team, where the agile team is actually the change advisory board for those changes. And if an agile team sees that they have certain changes that might impact other environments, they use a peer approval. So they ask other agile teams to review their change, and with that, it is done and controlled at an autonomous way. Yeah, and the next step is really to automate the whole release train. Yeah, and totally remove the waiting elements. So we call them waiting states or wait gates. Yeah, as a handover. Um, for most organizations that are in a hybrid mode, the truth is somewhere in between. Yeah, and so when an organization still has a very traditional IT environment where all the changes go to the change advisory board, frequently you will see that the change team deals with a big backlog of changes that are not being assessed yet. Start with redefining standard changes. Yeah, meaning look back at all the changes we did in the last period. Last period can be half year, 1 year, and out of those changes, we really look at which changes causes incidents and which changes did not cause incidents. And those changes that did not cause incidents, assess them and try to standardize them as much as possible and appoint them as standard changes. And those changes still needs to be registered, but do not have the need for a change advisory board. Yeah, that helps an organization to start moving towards a change advisory board that only focus on changes that requires control. Hence, the more riskful changes. Yeah, and that is in general. Yeah, you don't even need to have agile teams to do so. In general, that makes change management far more effective and efficient. Yeah, I remember this still from the traditional world where an engineer says, "Hey, I need to do this change. Doing this change only takes me 10 minutes. Nothing can go wrong. But now I need to write a request for change. Writing a request for change takes me a half hour. Then I need to submit it to the change team. They normally take 3, 4 days to approve. And after approval, they never reject, but after approval, only then I can do this change. So previously, this change only took me 10 minutes. Now it takes me more than 5 days. How is this effective and efficient? And I think we all have the answer. It is not effective or efficient. It is over controlled. Yeah, and so the first step I normally go through when helping organizations to create a more agile change environment. That still can be done if you don't even have agile teams, though. Yeah, and when I work with these teams, first try to assess what are standard changes or which type of changes do apply for the status standard change, and then make a good change impact cascading. So understand who needs to approve at what level with what change impact. Yeah, and that also means that you focus on the proper change authorities around it. Yeah, and the next thing is how can we make sure as a change management team that every change is successful. Yeah, and that moves the mindset away from trying to control every change to a mindset that is focusing on facilitating each change. Yeah, and that is a totally different approach. But you will see that if you start experimenting with that approach, that the reluctancy to submit changes reduces significantly, and the effectiveness of change management increases significantly. Yeah, and this already is a great way to push the 80% at a lower level. Yeah, so remember what I said earlier, 80% of the incidents are caused by changes. It really shows that over controlling changes doesn't help. Yeah, it is better to facilitate. Now that is a scary thought at the beginning, but the moment you start working with it, you will see that it has a positive effect. Yeah. Now, in your scenario, are you more towards service management thinking or more towards the agile thinking? Yeah, I'm not surprised by the first responses. Okay, and I think it is pretty much in line with the governance approach. Yeah, it is the behavior that automatically comes with a regulated environment, and we tend to think more in terms of control than in terms of value. Yeah, and that is something in a culture that really needs to change if we want to move to a more agile approach. Yeah, and as I said, you don't need agile teams in order to go that direction, but you will see positive effects when once you move the mindset towards value and outcome-based thinking rather than governance and control-based thinking. Now, risk management. Yeah, every change in the service management approach, this traditional service management approach, every change is assessed on the level of risk. Yeah, and when we say risk, that includes a lot of things. It's contingency risk, availability risk, capacity risk, security risk, um, uh, um, uh, external parties that are involved. Yeah, and that risk is translated what the impact will be towards the business. Yeah, and that normally becomes an assessment that lets us understand if we accept it or if it is unaccepted. Yeah. Whereas in an agile approach, yeah, so this is much more based on learning. Yeah. And I know that in a lot of organizations, learning comes with experimenting, and experimenting is an extremely dirty word. It cannot be trusted, but this is basically what improvement is all about. Yeah. So in an agile way of thinking, we act, we learn from that action, and we improve our future actions based on our learnings. Yeah. So we much more talk about an analytic risk scoring of each change. Yeah, and we make sure that we properly can measure it. Yeah, and that gives us learning on how to deal with future changes. And you will see that if you use that in a right way, that this really helps with the awareness in the teams. Yeah, and I think that is really an important part, because I might be an engineer that tries to do the best work I do from a technical perspective, not being aware about the consequences of my actions. Yeah, and this learning really helps to think a few steps further in a cause and effect scenario, what the consequences of my action will be. Yeah. Um, yeah, from a service management thinking approach, normally my first step will be is to assess if an organization actually measures how many incidents are due to changes. They have a change management tool, they have an incident management tool, but I've seen in a lot of organizations that all the incidents just appear in an incident management tool without linking them to requests for changes. And if we want to get insight in what really standard changes are and how to create more autonomy as to whom should make the right discussion about the change, you need to have that feedback mechanism, and measuring all the incidents you have and being able to relate incidents to just failing technology or being able to link them to requests for changes. And that feedback loop really helps us to properly understand what the impacts of our changes are. It helps with risk governance and change assessment in that approach. Yeah, so make sure that you build in monitoring and measurement to really understand the consequences of things. Um, if those mechanisms do not exist, an agile way of working will not help. Yeah, because there are no proper feedback loop, and we don't have the actual ability to measure the consequences of our actions. Now, same question again. Yeah. Where do you guys think you are towards this approach? More this traditional service management or the agile approach, the agile kind of thinking? Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it slowly irons out towards which area you lean to. Yeah. Now, the building part, yeah. We see, and this is part of the silo approach, again, in the service management thinking. Yeah, changes are built in development. They are pushed to a test environment for user acceptance testing. Yeah, and then they are pushed to a production environment, or in some organizations, they have a staging environment where it goes to first. Yeah. Here is a serious thing to consider. Um, if your test environment is not comparable to production, your test quality is fairly low. Yeah, you can have some scenarios understood and some errors understood during testing, but cannot avoid the concept that the real testing happens in production. And one thing that we want to approach as much as possible in an agile scenario is fail fast. Yeah, and I hope you understand what I'm trying to say with that. I still see that a lot of people don't get the concept of fail fast. Fail fast doesn't mean fail as fast as you can. Fail fast means if you need to fail as early as possible in the planning cycle, yeah, or in the life cycle of a change, and not at the end. Failing in production is failing at the end. Yeah. Failing during development driven testing or behavior driven testing is fairly at the beginning of the life cycle. That means you can already apply learning throughout the building to avoid errors that eventually ends up in production. Yeah. Now, if we really go in that direction, yeah, and then I think this is really pushing the whole discussion towards DevOps. yeah, where we start building using containers. Containers are being tested and implemented, and this becomes much more a focus on CI/CD automation and infrastructure as a code. Yeah. So yeah, the quality of your and by the way, yeah, saying that the only way that DevOps really works is when we really have cloud-driven infrastructure. Yeah. So if you have a traditional infrastructure, CI/CD is a nice concept to think about, but it is close to impossible to actually deploy. Yeah. In an agile DevOps way, the agile DevOps way does not work without cloud technology. Yeah. And since every system is configured the same way, to automate it and use containers is the preferred mode to do that in a traditional way. If you have centralized and monolithic IT infrastructures, you can't avoid the test and staging scenario. Yeah, just make sure that they are as realistic as production as possible. No, same question again. Yeah, are you more towards the building according to the traditional way or more towards the agile way? Yeah, and that in my assumption that also means that the majority of you probably still have quite some legacy in your infrastructure that doesn't really allow for CI/CD automation. Uh, right. Now, the actual testing, yeah. So what I described already earlier with the build as well. Um, Testing is very sequential. We have user acceptance testing, staging, and then the deployment testing before we actually release. And these tests are done in a very manual way frequently. Normally, what I know from manual testing is that we create a test script that clearly describe what we should test, and to avoid that we do testing for weeks, we optimize that test script that is really focused on this particular change we do. Yeah. In an agile versus DevOps way, yeah, we don't consider testing a separate phase. It's totally built in the whole release train. It's built in the change pipeline. Yeah, it is fully automated. And we automate even at a level where we talk about development-driven testing, behavior-driven testing. Yeah, it simplified. It means we test things that are wrong and we test things that should go wrong. Yeah, so I write a test script that if those test scripts, the elements in those test scripts fail, then we should not release it. And I write, and that is the behavior-driven test script, sorry, the deployment-driven test script. The behavior-driven test script is where we deliberately write tests that should fail. If those tests don't fail, we can't trust the deployment. And this can be fully automated. And the beauty with that approach is that I don't care what kind of change we are doing. I just run the total script and I test everything because it's fully automated, and that gives a significant more a significant higher level of assurance of the quality of an implementation. Yeah, the more manual we do, the more we try to scope what we need to test, and a lot of things are actually slipping through that scenario. Yeah, same discussion as with the previous slide. The more a test environment is a simple extraction of the way we run production, the less the quality of the changes, and you can't avoid that in this scenario. The actual change is in production, but not in test. Yeah, sorry, the actual test is in production, but not in a test environment. And when we start talking about this in the when we do automated A/B testing, yeah, which is better, the original version or the new version? We have an automated rollback mechanism, and we don't need to worry about that. Yeah. Now, I think I have a pretty good idea about which direction you guys are going with this, but let's do this anyway. Yeah, it's still more towards manual testing, or are you guys more towards automated testing? Yeah, as I said, this didn't surprise me. Yeah. Now, the deployments, yeah, do we work with change windows or do we deal with micro changes? Yeah, and it is the continuous discussion we already had. Yeah, if I have a lot of legacy in my infrastructure, I really focus on release windows, and release windows can be once a month or once a quarter, depending on the technology we are using. Yeah. Um, and the whole concept of release windows is that we actually complicate changes because we bundle all changes together to do one big release. Yeah, and if something doesn't work, we do a full rollback of everything. That means we also waste a lot of value with a rollback. Um, but we can't. Yeah, some organizations actually have a breakdown in the release plan where they actually can test what part of the release needs to be rolled back and what part can stay. Yeah, but it is a lot of manual effort and it takes a lot of time, both in terms of testing as deployment. Yeah, whereas in an agile way, we do really small changes, and if we really go to DevOps and continuous deployment, we don't wait until the end of a sprint. Whenever something is ready and meets the acceptance criteria, it is automatically released. Yeah, and it is ready in the environment frequently as with a feature toggle. It is hidden, and the business can decide when new functionality comes alive, and it is already there in the infrastructure. Yeah, it is just a matter of proper timing for the market to bring a feature alive. But it's already there, it's already tested. Yeah, and that is really towards the continuous deployment. We don't wait until the end of a sprint. Whenever something is ready, it is deployed. Yeah, and that is really possible if we have an automated release stream. Yeah, I think I can skip this one because it is very much aligned with the previous slide. Yeah. Let's do the last one, traceability. Yeah. Um, if we are heavily regulated, then there is a significant effort in making sure that everything is documented and in a proper audit environment. Yeah. Um, in an agile way, if we have automated it, this can be in an automated audit trail, and it's at the press of a button, and you have all the information. Where in a manual way, before an audit, you have to make sure that you collect all the data so that it can be validated. Yeah. Um, Now, what is important with a proper approach is the cascading of how we deploy things. Yeah, and the origin of this picture is actually from what we call the V model. Yeah, and try to build your traceability as well as your testing at steps. Yeah, so what we do in a traditional way, we capture the requirements, we design architecture, we design the models, we do the coding. Yeah, we build everything together and then we do acceptance testing. And if in the acceptance test something fails, we have to redo everything again. Yeah, where if you can break it down, and it's part of the concept of fail fast. Yeah, when we already do unit testing, Then integration testing. If something fails here, we only have to go one step back, and we don't have to do the whole thing again. Yeah, that saves a lot of time. This is all significantly easier to automate and to trace. Yeah, and with that you have a more consolidated view of how successful you are in your changes and where it frequently fails. Yeah. Now, in that scenario, yeah, your traceability, is that more traditional or more agile? Do you guys make use for automated audit trails? Yeah, even if you're heavily regulated, I think automated audit trails actually have more value and benefit than if you are not so heavily regulated. Yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah. And then the guidance, I assume you guys are familiar with this. Yeah, the traditional service manner thinking. ITIL, still very popular in the market. COBIT for governance. Yeah. Where in an agile approach, yeah, we make use of Scrum, DevOps, site reliability engineering. When we deal with multiple teams, we need to scale. Now there are different models to that. Spotify, less, safe. Yeah, and if we really go towards an agile approach, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Kulefin methodology, but that is really what we do in chaos engineering. Yeah, we heavily focus on just act, do a step, yeah, test it, learn from it, and only then we decide what our next step will be. Yeah, so that is really an iterative way of working, where we do not have the ability to predict what the future will be. So the only thing we can do is an action and then understand what the consequence of that action is, and use that learning how we plan the rest of our future. Yeah, so that is basically the last discussion in this. Yeah, are you guys more towards ITIL and COVID, or are you guys more towards Agile, DevOps, safe in your organization? There is one in the middle. Yeah, that means really hybrid. All right. Now that basically concludes my discussion with you. I hope uh, I hope the webinar was insightful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to point them out now. Yeah. Or later in the chat we can come back with it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mikhail. So if let's say you have any questions, feel free to send us your question by clicking on the Q&A icon or the chat icon from your screen. We will try to answer all your questions during the Q&A sessions.
Yeah. Or we come back to it later.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course. We do have one question coming in. It say, how does agile integration impact the risk management aspect of IT change management?
All right. Now, well, first of all, in Agile we do small steps, and the smaller our steps are, the smaller the risk are as a consequence of those steps. So we with an iterative approach, we actually can adjust our risk management approach, and you will see that a lot of risks actually really can be determined within the development team, within the agile team, rather than using a lot of experts around your organization in the change advisory board. Yeah, so what is really important for a risk management approach is that you cascade at different risk levels where the risk assessment takes place. So how does it impact IT change management? And I hope I made that clear during the discussion earlier, is that try to identify different impact levels. Yes, start with identifying standard changes and work from there.
Thank you, Mikhail. I see another questions coming in. It say what role does leadership play in the successful integration of Agile in traditional IT change management structures?
All right. Well, I think what is really crucial in that discussion is that, um, first of all, from a leadership perspective, is try to understand the nature of both environments, the agile way of working versus the traditional way of working. Yeah, and see how you can mend that. And then I've given a few examples in this webinar, how you can mend that in your organization. And from that moment on, it's really important to lead by example. Yeah, if you want to change a culture, if you want to change the kind of thinking in an organization, you should, as a leader, you should give the example to your peers in the organization. If management still focus on rigid controls, you can't expect that the people in the organization take an agile approach. Yeah, so it starts with the leadership mindset first before you can expect that an organization changes its mindset and its culture.
Great. Okay, we have time for a last questions. The last question is, what metrics or KPIs would you recommend to measure the success of agile integration in IT change management?
Okay, so there are a number of aspects. First of all, don't try to measure the hard things. Yeah, and what I mean with the hard things is the actual amount of incidents and things like that. Those are the hard factors. Start really working on the value factors. So, is there improved collaboration? Yeah? Is there improved knowledge sharing? Is there improved peer support during risk assessments? Yeah, because what you want with your measurement, one thing that is really important to understand with measurement is the way you measure people highly influences the way they behave. Yeah, so if I give people hard targets, their mindset is only about achieving those hard targets. If I give people a measurement that is aiming at improving, you will see that it causes an improved mindset in an organization as well. Yeah, and here is the point where I think still a lot of organizations make the mistake with key performance indicators or KPIs. They think KPIs are targets. KPIs are not targets. A KPI is the progress you make towards your target, and that is what you want to stimulate. Yeah, so the measurement, and this, I know this is a really high level answer, and I can dive much deeper in that, but we don't have the time for that. Um, Focus on behavior improvements in your organization. Measure the aspects I just came with, improved collaboration, improved knowledge sharing, improved peer support. Yeah, because the moment you stimulate that, the rest is an automatic consequence of it. Right? So that should be the focus, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mikhail. Can you move to next slide, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Um, Give me one moment. I have my
No problem.
remote out of sight. This one. Yep.
Okay, thank you for you guys to join us today, and thank you, Mikhail, the consulting guru from MyMagine, and also our training partners, Phoenix One. Before we end this webinar, can you fill out the form? Just use your mobile phone and scan the QR code, or should we just copy the link from this slide, and then answer a few questions to help us to improve our future webinars? Thank you. If let's say you have any other questions, we have our contact, our emails and things like that. You can contact us by emails if let's say you have further questions. Or you can contact Phoenix One. We'll email you later. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks for your time. Selamat.
Nikhil, can you move the last slide?
Yep, I can.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.